Hello, this is Pastor Blake, and we'll continue our study with Joshua chapter 10, verses 29 through the rest of the chapter 43, and then through chapter 11. These are some big amounts of scripture that we see. However, they're pretty self-explanatory, really, when you read through them, because it's just talking about the conquest. It's talking about each city to city to city that they stopped, and a little bit of what happened during the cities, but some of them are basically that he went to this city, he destroyed it. He went to this city, he destroyed it. He continued this city, he destroyed it. But we are going to look at him because Joshua had a big amount of land that he had to conquer because the Lord had given them the land, but they had to push out the people from the land. And so we see that there's three basic conquests. We see the middle conquest, the central conquest, which he kind of already had done. That was the 5 kings that came together. And now he's going to go through the southern conquest, and then he's going to go back up to the central, and then go to the northern conquest. And at the very end, he has to go back down and deal with a few more Anakim in the south. So let's get into it. So you see in verses 29 through 30, after the 5 kings were killed, Joshua and Israel went to Libnah and destroyed everything. Now remember, right at the beginning of chapter 10, verses 1 through 28, the 5 kings around them, the sun stood still over Gibeon, and the 5 kings came together, and Joshua will destroy them. And so God is just doing a lot of amazing things in the people of Israel's lives. And Joshua is the leader, and people are following him. And so this is a good time for Israel in a way, because they're really having momentum in the promised land at this moment. But there is much more work to be done. And so when you start reading, then Joshua and all the people of Israel with him passed on from Makkedah to Libnah and fought against Libnah. And the Lord gave it also and its king into the hand of Israel. And he struck it with the edge of the sword and every person in it. He left none remaining in it. And he did to its king just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And just as he'd done, he brought out the king, he killed him, he laid him at the gates, he covered him with some rocks to make sure everyone understood this place is not a kingdom anymore. This place is destroyed. And so verses 31 through 33, from Libnah, he went actually to Lachish and conquered Horam, the king of Gezer. Tried to help, but he was also conquered as well. So from Libnah, he went down into Lachish, and he conquered them. But the king of Horam, he tried to come up. He said, hey, I'm probably going to be next. If you look at a map, I would encourage you to look at a map while you're going through this part of Joshua. A map will really help you understand the concept of where all of these places are. So just look up Conquest of David map, Conquest of Canaan map, and it'll pretty much show you all the cities and all the areas and kind of give you some direction. And so Horam knew he was one of the next people to go. So he had to help these people out. He had to get and hey, you know what? Let's two kingdoms together, we can maybe destroy them. Even though 5 kings already proven that they could not do this. The Lord was truly fighting with Israel at this time. And so Horam actually was conquered as well. And so he someone came to them instead of them having to go to them. And then from 34 to 35, you see from Lachish, they go to Eglon, keep on going down, and 36 to 37, Eglon to Hebron, kept on going down, and then kept on going down. Verses 38 through 39, from Hebron, they headed south and destroyed Debir. Now, Debir is quite a bit of ways. It kind of is a curve up from where they did, and then boom, straight down again. So Debir it looks really to be the most southern place that they went. However, there was more places that they did conquer along the way. And so in verses 40 through 43, we see that after they destroyed Debir at the very end, Joshua had conquered everything south that was considered the promised land. And we see this word Negeb. Let's read it, 40 through 43. You see, so Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country and the Negeb and the lower land and the slopes and all their kings. He left none remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathe, just as the Lord God of Israel commanded. And Joshua struck them from Kadesh Berean as far as Gaza and all the country of Goshen, as far as Gibeon. And Joshua conquered all these kings in their land at one time, because the Lord God of Israel fought for Israel. Then Joshua returned all of Israel with him to the camp of Gilgal. And so you're saying everything south was basically conquered. There was no one else that was considered in the promised land. Now, there was more people south, but no one in the promised land, southern, was really left. And we see this word Negeb, when you look that up, it actually means dry south. The word Negeb, dry south. So if you look at how south it goes, when you start curving on, keep on going, you get to Egypt. So consider that all of that's kind of desert area. So it's just a very dry, but in the southern part of the promised land. And so that's what they mean by Negeb. And then they returned to Gilgal. They returned kind of where the central conquest really began. And that's where their camp was. So that's where a lot of the women and the children were. But he was taking his leaders and his mighty men and his fighters, the men of Israel, fighting and going into the conquering. And so now they're on their way back up. Now they're going to be at Gilgal once again. So then we go to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is just like that end of chapter 10, but it's the northern conquest. So instead of going through the central, now we went to the southern. Now we're going to go up north. All these kings would have been knowing what was happening along this time. Now the north is a much bigger area to conquer than the south. Although the south, if you look at it on a map, has many, many more cities. However, the north is a bigger area to physically go around to. So the chapter 11 starts off verses 1 through 5. Most of the northern kings heard about what was happening just south of them. They came together to fight against Israel and to try and conquer them for good. But in verse 6, it's so powerful. And Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Meron and fell upon them. And so God is speaking to him, look, I'm still fighting for you. You will take all of them on yourself. You will be able to conquer this. And so Joshua spoke, reassuring him. And that's amazing that God will do that even. God is reassuring him, hey, I know that you hear about all these kings wanting to come against you. But guess what? I am still fighting for you. I am still God. I am still on the throne. I have a mission for you. And as long as you follow me, that mission will be accomplished. And all of these people were truly following God at this point. And so verses 7 and 9, we see that the great battle took place when they got to Moron. Israel conquered all of them, but had to pursue them in order to finish the conquest, kind of into verse 9. And we see that Moron is a place, it had some hill country kind of area around it. And so when it says they came upon them, basically they were walking around a hill and both armies met each other. And so they started fighting. And so Joshua had to spring into action. His men were ready for battle. They were starting to conquer. So in verses 10 through 11, Joshua had to make a quick turn south to conquer Hazor. Hazor seemed to be the capital of the area. He burned the city down. Now, if you look on a map, you will see how they went up, and then all of a sudden they go south real quick. And then they go back, kind of retrace themselves and keep going north just a little bit farther. But it does seem to be the capital of the area. If you read verses 10 through 11, Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hebron and struck its king with the sword. For Hazor formerly was the head of all of those kingdoms. And they struck it with the sword and all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. There was none left that breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. And so it seems as though this is the capital of all of the kind of the Canaanites of the area. We don't exactly know what it meant by it being the capital, because each one of these people had their own kings, but it just, I guess, just the capital. So when the main guy lived there, that kind of controlled the area. And probably they were the people that gathered the kingdoms together to try to fight Israel. And so Joshua knew he needed to destroy this. He needed to burn it to the ground to make sure anyone coming in saw the capital, the big city, the place that was the most protected, fell to this little nation walking around in the desert for the last 40 years, have now came in, and they are taking the land that God has given them. All right, and then when we see that verse 12 through 13, Joshua did what Moses had told them, and destroyed all the cities, killed all the people with the sword. He only burnt Hazor with fire. He didn't burn everything with fire. He kind of kept on the conquest. Sometimes they would go kind of from town to town. He didn't burn everything. However, the capital city being such a beacon of power, he needed to make sure everyone understood this is no longer powerful. And so in verses 14, 15, we see the people were allowed to take some plunder. Joshua did what Moses could not do because he was being barred from the promised land. We know that Moses was not allowed to come in, and all of the spoils of the city and the livestock and people of Israel took their plunder, but every person they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed, just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant. So Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Moses couldn't go into the promised land. He struck the water instead of spoke to it from the rock, and that outburst of anger, that uncontrollable, God barred him from the promised land. He got to see into it. He did see physically the promised land into it, but he was not able to go into it. And so, but Joshua, we see, was faithful. He kept control of himself pretty much at all times, it really seems, and he was able to do what Moses could not do. But remember, he kept following the law of Moses that he was given the whole time. So all of this time, people were still making sacrifices. They were still living the way they were supposed to be living. However, Joshua was doing something Moses simply could not do. And so in verses 16 to 18, we see Joshua had conquered the land and destroyed everyone in it. He put every king to death. And in verses 19 and 20, no one made peace with Joshua except for the Hivites, remember. The Lord hardened everyone's heart to keep them warring against Joshua. This was in part to cleanse the land from anyone who could push Israel away from God. Remember, we talked about in Deuteronomy and in the law, it talks about how, look, you got to get rid of these people. These people are so incredibly evil. Don't feel bad for these guys. These guys were given 400 years of Israel in Egypt to turn to God. Abraham turned to God. Isaac was for God. A lot of people were for God. Joshua was for God. Moses was for God. People had a chance. And then they heard what God had done in Egypt. Remember Rahab talking about in Jericho? People knew who these people were and what had happened to Egypt. So then they were given another 40 years. And then so 440 something years, these people were given the chance to turn to God. And so when we see this, we're like, oh man, God have mercy. He had mercy on them for 440 something years. And now Joshua is finally getting the chance to bring judgment upon these people. These people were evil people. These people sacrificed children on the altar of Molech, and they had horrible immorality that they did, horrible sins that they were doing against God. And so God eventually will punish and will judge every single nation that is turning from him. These people were not doing that, and so Joshua and the people of Israel were being used as an instrument of judgment. Now, the Canaanite or other people were actually later on, the Babylonians were used as a judgment against Israel. And so God doesn't just take care of his own and forget others. Everyone is kind of on the same playing field. However, Israel is a special people group, but God, even himself, does not spare Israel from a judgment. God will judge those who do not follow him. And so we see in verse 21, after the northern conquest, Joshua went back down south to push back the Anakim from the hill country. Now, he had to go quite a bit down south because they had Anakim outside of the realm of the promised land had started to come up, hearing how this tribes were warring, and these people were destroyed. There wasn't probably a lot of people in these cities. Hey, we could maybe come and take in some land before this other Israel, before Israel even knows we're here. And so he had to go back down south again, a little bit of ways, not the full way, but a little bit of ways, to actually make sure all of the Anakim were taken care of. They were pushed back, and so he did push them back from the hill country. This helped set up, though, also the southern border. This really helped establish, okay, this is where our land is. You don't come in it, we won't even mess with you. But you're not going to come into our land. You're not going to take us over. You will stay right where you're at, and you will not go any further. And so in verse 22, at the end, there was only a few Anakim left in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. The Anakim were a race of giants, and the spies were scared of. Remember back in Numbers 13:33, I'll read it for you. And there was, and there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, the Anakim, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And so that was one of the reasons why they had to not really, they were not allowed to go into the promised land at that moment. Those people who were not trusting in God to get them out of the situation, God was not allowing them to go into the promised land. And so some of the Anakim remain in just kind of pieces of it. You can look on your map to see kind of those cities. It was right around the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so right in there, it's basically almost coastland cities. Ashdod more than Gath and Gaza, but Gaza was right back in a river a little bit. So they had access to the sea. And so Joshua had completed the conquest of Canaan. Now Joshua had to separate all the allotments of the land of Israel. And that's where we leave it. So Joshua took the whole land in verse 23 according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. Now after that, I can only imagine that Joshua would have wanted to just set for a moment. This was a lot of warring, and he was leading these people through all this too. And so we see that sometimes in the hard points of life, God is not necessarily going to keep you from the war. He's going to help you. He's going to fight with you. But sometimes God is helping us through situations instead of saving us from. Actually, really, you read the Bible, he doesn't save people from a lot of situations. Later on, you see more like getting Peter out of jail, getting Paul out of the shackles and stuff. He more really takes that later, but really at first, you see God going with the people and are helping the people conquer, but he's not just wiping out people himself with plagues. He did that for Egypt. But we see all of this. The people had to be guided. The people had to trust in God and what he said he was going to do as well. And so we see in chapter 12 where he starts the allotment process and tons of information left. So until that time, blessings.